morning, everybody. Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to my constituency. I don't get the opportunity to say that very often, to a national gathering. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the National Emissions Ceilings Directive. I talk about the directive a lot, but to a very different audience to you. Normally I would spend at least 10 or 15 minutes talking about why air quality is important, the health impacts, Gothenburg Protocol, all of that. And I'm assuming that, having looked at your agenda yesterday and knowing where you're all coming from, I don't need to do that. So I'm not going to do that. What I think I could perhaps usefully do with you is talk a little bit around the politics in Europe and how that works, and what we can expect in terms of timeline for the NEC, and also possibly my views on outcome, and how that will relate then to the UK in particular's air quality plans. So, firstly, how much knowledge do I need to assume about how the European Union works? Does anybody think they have a clear view of how European legislation works? Hands up. None. Oh, one or two. Good. Okay. Well, you're in the minority, so please bear with me for a couple of minutes while I just explain it, because I think it's important to contextualise what else I'm going to say. So, European Union legislation works on the basis of the three institutions. European Parliament is not sovereign. It's not like the British Parliament holding an executive to account. It is part of a system that includes three institutions, the first being the Commission, the second being the Parliament, and the third being the Council being the member state governments. So when we talk about Environment Council, which will deal with air quality, we're essentially talking about the environment ministers from all the 28 member states and their associated helpmeets. So I sit in the Parliament, which is in the middle of that. So what happens is the Commission proposes the legislation. They are the guardian of the treaties, the guardian of the legal framework of the EU. They will propose a piece of legislation, they will pass it to the Parliament, we will take our time in reviewing it, amending it and voting on it, and that's a procedure I'll come on to in a moment. At the same time, the European Council, i.e. those environment ministers, are all arguing with each other, either directly or through their proxies, in a working group which attempts to put together the 28 member states' position on the proposal from the Commission. And at some point, all three of these have to come together and make an agreement. So you can see that whilst people often say the EU is too slow, it's part of the process, the democratic process, for it to be slow, because all three have to agree. So the point I'm making, the most particular point I'm making, and I ask you to remember, is that when we vote in the European Parliament, it is not either the beginning or the end of the process. It's what the Parliament thinks, but that's only part. We then have to negotiate. So, the Commission's proposal came out initially at the end of December 2013, after about 3 years' work putting it together. And I want to emphasise that when the Commission put a proposal together, they work very closely with stakeholders in all member states. So there's a big consultation. I'm sure many of you may have been asked to have been involved in that. Certainly our government, and I'm glad to see people in this room think roughly the same as I do about DEFRA. That's good. Certainly our government will have been involved in that, and they will have made their points. But I want to emphasise that the NEC is what's known as a framework directive. European legislation tends to work on two levels, particularly in the area of the environment. So we have framework directives, we have one on air, we have one on water, we have one on waste, we have one, we don't quite have one on soil, although we're trying to have. So we have frameworks which set member states' targets for improvement, largely. And then underneath those frameworks, which can run for a period of maybe 10 to 15 years, trying to look ahead, trying to plan ahead, and in a way, the bigger debate about Europe, but one of the purposes of the European Union is actually to plug that gap of long-term planning, which member state governments, for whatever reasons, ours is not unique, they are all the same. They tend to think in the length of their government. And the European Union can plug that sort of planning gap. So we try to look 10, 15 years ahead. So the Framework Directive looks at what the overall position should be. And then underneath that, we have a whole load of source legislation. And you'll be familiar, as professionals in this area, you will be familiar with things like, of course, the Ambient Air Quality Directive, but also things like the Industrial Emissions Directive, which will look at particular pollutants, like the sulphurs and we also, of course, have framework legislation on climate change, which looks at carbon. And I think it's worth mentioning that and emphasising that from a legislative point of view, because it's not an exaggeration to say that for the last decade, the European Union, along with its member state governments, has been rather obsessed with carbon. I make no value judgment on that, but I think, and I know many agree with me, that that has been to the detriment of air quality, because the concentration has been on reducing carbon and we haven't thought enough about the other pollutants. Some people wouldn't call carbon a pollutant. So pollutants in the air. And that's where the proposal from the Commission in December 2013 was really a very large proposal to plug that gap, to say, okay, it's time we started thinking about air quality again. Every one of the 28 member states is signed up to the Gothenburg Protocol, although not all ratified. And there's a political wrangle going on at the moment as to whether the European Union should ratify on behalf of all member states or they do it themselves. We have this all the time. But air quality needs to come up the agenda. So 2013 we had the proposal, and largely, I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, so I'll go through it very quickly. It's based on a primes model. It's all very sophisticated algorithmic modelling. I'm not an expert on that, so no questions on that, please. But effectively, what it's looking at is feeding in data from member states across a very wide-ranging and complex model, looking forward and giving member states targets on 6 pollutants. And they're individual targets. So there's an overall target for Europe, and that's then divided up by member states. So immediately you can see that as soon as member states get that, they're all looking at their bit only and seeing how that fits with their national plans and how they could make their numbers work. From a European Parliament's point of view, our job is to ignore that to some extent and try and look at what the overall picture is for Europe. And it's been an interesting process because, as with everything, when you've got a set of targets, and my job as an MEP is twofold. One, I'm an MEP and I have to look at the benefit of Europe, the EU as a whole, but I also represent my region. And my region here this is quite far in the north, but you go south from here and you see that the landscape is pretty much shaped by livestock farming, be it dairy, beef, sheep. So it's an issue. It's a political issue for me individually as to how these targets might affect my constituency. So the politics of it is quite complex. The overall good of Europe with the overall targets, then how they're divided at member state level. But what we're doing in the European Parliament at the moment is setting those overall levels for Europe. So that has to be also put in the context of the European Union's climate change aspirations. And you will know that Europe prides itself on leading on climate change in the world. And indeed, we have the first trading system for emissions. We have quite challenging targets for ourselves. So it's how do we slot in this air quality agenda with the carbon agenda? And we had some changes halfway through the process on carbon, which wasn't terribly helpful because we'd set a lot of figures. And then member states and the Commission decided on a new set of carbon targets. So those had to be recalculated, which happened in 2014, which also coincided with a new commission. And again, very European politics, but this new commission, which started in the middle of 2014, post the European elections, and you can see that the work on this particular agenda has straddled over an election period and a change of commission, which adds a little complicating factor. This new commission is very, very keen on what it calls better regulation, which, for those of you who are from NGOs, you will know is often interpreted by environmental NGOs particularly as being no regulation. And I just want to make a point about that. It simply is not the case as far as the Parliament's concerned. We are very clear that we subscribe to the better regulation agenda, but we don't want deregulation of environmental policy, because it is clear to me, and I'm a good conservative, but it is clear to me that unless we have environmental regulation, things would move much too slowly. Technology and the way we live moves fast. Regulation needs to move with it so that we can keep in line. So eventually, and there was a lot of threat that this whole air quality package would be removed, which many of the member states would have loved, because many of them were under threat of infraction on the Ambient Air Quality Directive. But we managed to get it going. So I'm the rapporteur, which means I'm the lead member. There is no equivalent in British politics, possibly the leader of the House, who is sort of responsible for pulling bills through the House of Commons, but obviously that's on a much wider basis. It's much more analogous to what happens in the US Congress, where you have a congressman who takes a bill through the House at every stage, and that's what we do. So what does my report say that the Commission didn't say? Well, I largely accepted the Commission's targets, albeit there's massive discussion amongst member states. They still haven't decided on their position. I accepted the targets, but I put in an extra bit, which was that targets should be binding for 2025 as well as 2030. So the reductions that we're looking for at member state level have to be online by 2025. Parliament is very keen on this on all environmental legislation, because where we have history of setting 10-year frameworks, everyone agrees, and we get to about, if it's 2020 to 2030, we'd get to about 2027, and member states would start saying, actually we can't do that. We're not going to make that. So we wanted to put in a 2025 binding target. That is in our voted position. We also, and this is very topical, I also put in a whole new article on real driving emissions testing, and saying that that had to be accelerated. So the system on RDE had to be accelerated and had to be in place before this new set of targets could be put in place, because there's a clear disconnect between what is actually happening and what the legislation says should be happening in terms of particularly NOx and PM via diesel vehicles. So I wanted to make reference that in legislation, because otherwise it's not going to get done quickly enough. We have a very much improved reporting mechanism for member states, where they must report on a much more frequent level, and they have to come back to the Commission and agree that their plans are going to make they're going to get to where they say they're going to get. So it's not a question if they've got a plan, they say, yes, that will do it, we put it in the drawer. They have to come, they have to agree with experts at the Commission that actually we all agree that plan will work. That is an adequate plan. You've no idea how politically sensitive that is. Very difficult to get member states to agree to that. We have also put in a lot about access to funding. You'll be aware that half of the European Union's budget is on agriculture. In the common agricultural policy, there's been a move, an emphasis towards a greening the CAP, as it's known, but there was no mention at all of air quality. So I put in the report that by 2017, we must have a midterm review of CAP, and we must have some of the funding moved into helping the agricultural industry reduce their ammonia and methane, You can't just tell them to do it overnight, give them no help. They're already getting an awful lot of public money, so let's move some of that public money earmarked for that job on air quality. There's a massive change to public participation and access to justice. I'm not entirely sure that's going to see the light of day by the time we get to the end of the negotiation, but it's in there. That's the Parliament's intent. And we've also made the link to climate change policy. So what we voted in our committee in July was that, but actually went beyond what I want. What it went to was lower levels than the Commission's proposal, moving towards WHO levels on the 6 pollutants. I'll come back to that in a second as to why I didn't want that. It added mercury as one of the pollutants. Again, I don't support that. Mercury, we have the Minamata, and mercury is very heavily regulated elsewhere. And also methane and ammonia, probably close to half the Parliament want to take both of those out. That gives you a nice view of the strength of the agricultural lobby in Europe. We didn't vote to take them out, but we go to a plenary vote on this next week. That's the full Parliament. And it's touch and go as to whether those will come out or not. And I've tried to put some compromise amendments in front of my colleagues. I'm hoping we'll have a nice middle ground compromise, but I cannot in any way guarantee that. So the point I really wanted to make about the plenary vote is that I get a lot of emails, maybe I have some from some of you, asking for the most ambitious possible proposal from the Parliament. And what I want to say is that would be a disaster. If we were to go to the higher levels in Parliament, and if we were to go to anywhere close to the WHO levels, as the Parliament, we would never, ever reach an agreement with the Member States. That's absolutely clear to me. I've discussed it with the Environment Minister of every single one of them. It's not a reflection of my opinion of what they should do. It's a reflection of my political opinion on what they will do. And if we put in those high levels of ambition, I think what we're putting in is pretty high already, but if we put in those very high levels, then the proposal will simply never see the light of day. Because under the way that the European Union legislation works, what the Member States will do is they will simply never come to an agreement. And if they don't come to an agreement between themselves, that can never be presented to the Parliament. That means we can go, and we have examples. If you think that's an empty threat, we have examples, and I mentioned soil before. That's a very good example. Parliament passed a framework directive on soil in 2007, and it has never seen the light of day because the Member States will not agree. So, my view is we have to have an ambitious but workable, and I'm absolutely confident that the numbers that the Commission are putting forward are just that. So if you may hear that I'm working against that higher ambition. I am not, but I am working very hard to get a political deal that we can get moving on, because we want this in legislation so that from 2020, the Member States are bound legally to start working towards their plans between 2020 and 2030. If we leave it, legislation runs out in 2020. So there's nothing on the table.
Duncan Laxon, yeah, that's better. Thank you, of Air Quality Consultants. I was just wondering if you could perhaps run through the likely timetable from now to when there might be final agreements in the Council as to they're going to go ahead with this.
Okay. Well, we have the unusual situation of voting next week in the Parliament on something that the Council don't have an agreement on. It's not unheard of, but it's unusual. We're pressing ahead with our vote. We're not waiting for their position. So we will vote next week. There is always a possibility we'll have to take it back if the Parliament vote against my proposal. But let's assume they don't. I don't think they will. We then wait for the Council. The Council have a number of meetings. We move presidencies from Luxembourg to the Netherlands at the end of this year. I don't anticipate them coming forward with an agreement under the Luxembourg presidency. I do anticipate, because I've met the Netherlands Environment Minister, who's an incredibly dynamic lady, it will happen under the Netherlands. But that means it might be as late as June next year. I'm hoping it will be March, but it could be as late as June. At that point, we go into what's known as the trilogue process, which could take 3 to 6 months. Again, I will chair that, so I would hope to speed that up. That's where you have the member states represented by the rotating presidency. This would be the Dutch Environment Minister, me representing the Parliament, the Commissioner representing the Commission, and we literally sit in a room until we hammer out an agreement. It can take, well, I've been in trilogues on other things that have gone to 4 or 5 sessions. They've gone overnight and all the rest of it. So we hope to avoid that. I think the issues here are very clear-cut, and I don't see the point in wrangling. But who knows? So we could see a deal probably by autumn of next year, and then to come into effect by 2020. So it will be clear and understood what it is by autumn, and then plenty of time to get ready for 2020. That's the best case. I am not in charge of what the council will do, whether they will come to an agreement. Individually, they're all pretty reticent at this stage. But we'll see how they feel after we've had our vote next week. But it's up to the public and up to all of us to put pressure on our governments to come to an agreement. It's not acceptable for them not to come to an agreement. In the council, well, that's really interesting. It doesn't have to be unanimous, but they never take a QMV decision on these sorts of issues. They will come to an agreement. Many of them will be dragged to the table reluctantly, and some of them will abstain, and some will vote. Some will say that they're against it, but a consensus will emerge, if that doesn't sound too Brussels bureaucracy. Some of them will not be happy, but the others need to pressurise them. And this is where, I say to our minister, okay, you need to go and strong arm, please, some of these reticent member states, Spanish, Germans, very bad. They haven't even put their figures on the table. Well, it is the case, I'm afraid. But, member state politics come into it. The Spanish have an election at the end of this year, so I imagine we will get their figures on January the 10th or so, depending on the results of that election.
Anybody else got a question? I've got one I want to ask. IASA, who run the gains model, they've estimated that with already agreed legislation, we're almost going to reach the 2030 target anyway. So
What's the point?
Yes.
What you mean, what's the point of updating the framework legislation?
No, not what's the point of updating it, but what's the point of keeping to the current targets when it's going to happen more or less anyway because of other legislation. As you said, this is framework legislation, but there's more detailed, like the medium-sized combustion.
Yes. But as you know, the medium-sized combustion plant legislation has gone through the Parliament, it's gone through trilogue, and it's not what was proposed. It's only what was proposed that went into the EASA model, not what came out at the end. So with all due respect to the EASA model, and I love it dearly because you have to have a reference point, you have to use that sort of reference point. You also have to accept margins of error. And those margins of error are down to member state activities around individual policies. And, well, the big gaping one, of course, is NOx emissions from cars. So I think it's the art of the possible via member states rather than the art of the projected via a computer model. But I'm not junking the model because that's the basis of all of our policy decisions. But, you flex one item in there and the whole thing shifts.
Yes, I'll ask a question for everyone's thinking. I'll say one more. Volkswagen?
Yeah.
What's your comment on that? What's the view in Europe?
Well, the view in Europe on Volkswagen, I could only say, is one of complete disbelief on the defeat device issue. But if anyone who is close to this area suggests that they didn't know that we weren't making the standards that were set on general emissions, I would question either whether they've been looking or doing their job or whether they're being honest, because it's been obvious for years that the system doesn't work. Now, having said that, in May of this year there was a breakthrough in Europe, which some of you will be aware of, where the Member States Technical Committee agreed that they would change the RDE. And they finally agreed to do it in 2 stages. First stage was voted in May. Second stage is going to be next Wednesday, 28th. That has now moved from a fingers crossed, let's hope the member states don't all fall out on the 28th, to an absolute certainty that they will come to an agreement. They can't not, when you look at the background and when you look at the fact that the public are now very well aware of what's happening. So Volkswagen, I said in a debate we had on Volkswagen a couple of weeks ago in Parliament, I must be the only MEP who's pleased that that happened. Pleased in the sense that I'm rapporteuring air quality. It's good news because it brings it further up the agenda. So ordinary people understand. Perhaps they don't understand all the intricacies. We need to explain that to them, but they understand that it's not been doing what it says on the tin. And that's a political failure, and Europe has to fix that and fix it quickly. So plans to do that are in place. Of course, the tricky bit comes. I'm absolutely sure we will reach an agreement on the new RDE and how it's the phasing in of the new RDE. And the balance between making sure that we don't have a macroeconomic collapse if the motor industry loses confidence and improving air quality is just one of those political tightropes that has to be walked. But I think it's doable. But there's going to be that odd period between next year, probably 2020, 2021, which will be the point at which no car will be put on the road that no longer conforms on a factor of 1 to 1. Explaining that's going to be tough. But, you've got engine plants churning out engines, and you want to turn them off overnight and put people out of a job, or do you want to sit down with the manufacturers, get a fast-track plan and get that changed? And I think, personally, I favour the latter, because we want to protect jobs and the economy as well. But it's absolutely the case that we have to, and that's where the member states have really got to step up and take that on. The Commission, I can tell you, I had a meeting with the Commissioner only this week about it, and I'm absolutely clear that they're committed to dealing with this. So they should be. They're culpable for having let it happen. But the member states have to do so too. So watch with interest next Wednesday and see.